Hi everyone and welcome to this just-in-time training. My name is Dejan Stanic and today I will be guiding you through the deployment of two-tier application environment on Google Cloud. Just before we start, let's have a brief overview of today's agenda. First, we will go through the architectural diagram, then we will go through the requirements, and after that we will look into what we need to have in place in order to be able to run a deployment that is going to be automated with Google Deployment Manager. Once we have all of this in place, we will go through the guided demonstration, and together we will deploy two-tier environment that is going to be protected by VM-Series. When everything is up and running, we will run some tests, and as a last step, we will see some additional resources. Let's jump into architectural diagram. What you can see here is our goal for today, which is to deploy two-tier application environment that consists of a web server that runs Apache and hosts WordPress, as well as a database server that is running MySQL. We will also secure everything by using VM-Series. To achieve this, we will use one of our publicly available scripts for Google Cloud Deployment Manager, which you can find on a GitHub repository. Also, to simplify the process, we published on a just-in-time training repository a package with all the scripts that are needed for this deployment, but we strongly suggest that you actually follow this link and download the latest version just before your deployment in order to have all the latest updates in place. We will deploy this architecture end-to-end in a fully automated way by combining bootstrapping, which is a feature of VM-Series Firewall that allows us to load a predefined configuration into Firewall during boot up and also automate its overall deployment. And second component, very important for us, is Google Cloud Deployment Manager, which we will use to automate overall process. Just before we start with our deployment, let's have a first look of requirements, as well as what do we need to prepare before we start the automated deployment. So if we look into the requirements, one of the first things that we will need to have in place will be a Google Cloud account as well as subscription. In case you don't have a Google account already, you can find in the deployment guide URL to register, as well as to subscribe for $300 of consumption that is valid for 12 months. So that should be really more than enough to get you started. Once we have all of this in place, we will need to have access to Google Console, which of course we will get as soon as we register, and we will also need to use command line interface to start the deployments, and for that you will be needed to install Google SDK on your machine. Beside of this, our strong advice is just to double check in the marketplace if you need to accept VM-Series end user license agreement, because for this deployment we will be using pay-as-you-go images. And last but not least, you will need to go to download to this GitHub URL and download the package with all the scripts, deployment guide, as well as bootstrapping configuration files. We will now start by going to the Google Console and create a project. Then we will double check that Google Deployment Manager as well as Compute Engine APIs are enabled, and after that we will configure bootstrapping by creating a Google storage bucket and uploading all the needed configuration files. And finally, we will gather all information such as project ID, SSH keys, and all other stuff, update deployment template, and then we will launch the template and let the magic happen. Once everything is being deployed, we will review the configuration in a Google Console, and then we will log into the firewall and some portals and start attacks. Welcome to the guided demonstration. We will start by selecting and opening this URL. It is going to take us to GitHub repository where we have all the scripts as well as deployment guide to fully automate and deploy this solution. First thing which we will do is we will download the repository. So we will select here to download it and say, for example, download in a zip format. Now that we have archive, we will open it and extract, and there we will find two-tier template folder. There you will find, first of all, GCP Deployment Manager how-to guide, and also we will find all the scripts as well as diagrams that we might need. So we will start first by reviewing deployment guide, and I just want to show you that if you go from the beginning, you will have really nicely explained how to create GCP account. You will also have links to how to download and install Google Cloud SDK, how to create the project, enable the APIs, and pretty much all the details to be able to run this from the beginning till the end. We will assume that we have this part ready, and we will start from the creation of the project. To do so, we will go to Google Cloud Console, and here we are. And first thing which we will do here is we will select this section where we are able to create a new project, and we will say new project. We will give the name to our project, and I'm going to call it two-tier demo 2, and we will say create. Now that our project is created, what we will do is we will make sure that it's selected. And the first thing that we need to do is we need to check and ensure that Compute Engine API as well as Deployment Manager API are enabled. So we will go to APIs and Services, and we will select Library. There you will be able to search. So my suggestion would be start with compute, and we will get here Compute Engine API. When we select it, we will see if it is enabled. In our case it's not, so it's important that we select it here, enable, and give it some time to finish the process. This part is very important because if you don't enable Compute Engine API as well as Deployment Manager, first of all, you will not be able to deploy anything and automate, so your deployment is going to fail. And second thing is that even if you would have a Deployment Manager enabled and not enable the Compute Engine, then you will not be able to deploy any VM. So these two things are really important that we do before we proceed. Now that our Google Compute Engine API is enabled, we will go back and we will look for Deployment Manager. So if you go back to the library and type deploy, we will get Deployment Manager. And what we can see here is that in my case it's not, so I'm gonna enable Deployment Manager as well for this project. And we will again give it some time and continue as soon as it is enabled. Deployment Manager API is enabled, so now we can go and create our storage bucket and prepare bootstrapping. This we can do by again selecting the menu and going to storage. In storage we will use the browser, and first what we will do is we will create a bucket. To create bucket, we will have to define the name, so let's call it two-tier store, and I'm gonna give it number 2. Then you need to select if you want it in multi-regions or regional. In our case we will leave it in a multi-regional, and you can specify location which is closest to you. In my case I will use United States. So now I will just say create, and there we are, we have our bucket ready. When we have our bucket prepared, we need to create 4 folders for bootstrapping. So I will start by creating config, then we will add software, and third will be license, and fourth will be content. Now that we have these 4, we will open config, and then we will go to our repository that we downloaded from GitHub in order to copy, or better to say, in order to upload bootstrap.xml and init-cfg. We will upload two files that we need by selecting upload files, and then we will select the first bootstrap XML, and then we will select init-cfg, and there we are. Now that we have these two files, we are pretty much ready, so firewall configuration is in place. We will now go back to the root of our bucket, and here we will need to upload two more files. One will be a configuration script for database server, and the second will be configuration script for web server. Again, we will use upload files. We will select first DB server startup, and then we will select web server startup script. Now that we have bootstrapping and configuration startup scripts in place, we can move to preparation of deployment manager template and start our deployment. We will start this process by going back to our repository. In the repository, we will look for a Python file, which is our deployment manager template. It is called two-tier template, and we will open it with the editor of our choice. In my case, I will use Visual Studio Code. And now that we have everything open, we can see here what are the parameters or variables that we need to edit. So if you look in here, what we will need to do is define first the region where we will deploy our solution. We will need to specify the zone within that region. We will provide our SSH key, the names of Bootstrap bucket, and at the end we will need to provide a service account for compute engine. All the name of available regions as well as corresponding zones you can find very easily in Google documentation, but I would like to provide you a little bit more easier way, and that is by running two very simple commands from Google CLI. You will be able actually to get all the details that you need. So we will now look into these commands. First thing which we are interested in is to get the details about regions. You can get the latest list of the regions by running gcloud compute regions list. And when you do this, you will get all the available regions in a Google Cloud and their names. So for the first parameter, which is a region, we have the names here, and now we can select one. So for example, I will select US Central 1. Now that we know the region, it's important that we find and define a zone which of course exists in that region, or our deployment will fail. So to get the list of the zones, you can use very straightforward command, which is gcloud compute zones list, and then you can filter it by the region that you are interested in. So I will use US Central 1, and here we can see that in US Central 1, we have 4 availability zones, which are A, B, C, and F, and in my case, I will be using A. So now that we have these informations, we will go back to our configuration file. And also, to speed up the process of this demonstration, I already edited my configuration file. So instead of typing, we will just review it. As you can see here, I'm having a region US Central 1, zone is US Central 1A. I've provided my SSH key. Bootstrap bucket is two-tier store 2. This is the one that we created at the beginning of this demonstration. And then last thing which I provided here is a service account. To get details of service account for Compute Engine, we will need to go back to Google Cloud Console, and there from the main menu we will select IAM and admin and look for the account with the name Compute Engine default service account. So now that we have it, we will copy it and paste it as service account variable. Once we've finished with all of this, we actually prepared our template. We will save it, and then we will go back to our command line interface, from where we will start our deployment. So now that we are ready to start the deployment, we will first authenticate ourselves over the CLI. And once we do that, we will associate corresponding project with our CLI session, and after that we will start our deployment. So to start, what we will do is we will run the following command: gcloud auth login, and then provide our credentials. Now that we did that, we will need to specify a project that we want to use for this deployment, and to do that we will have to go to the console, and in the dashboard we will find our project ID. Once we copied project ID, we will go back to command line interface and run gcloud config set project and paste project ID. And since we have everything in place, we will now ensure that we are in the folder where we have all the deployment scripts, so the one that we downloaded from GitHub. And in my case, if I do this, we can see that I am in the folder 2-tier template. So now we will run the deployment by executing command gcloud deployment manager deployments create deployment 1. Deployment 1 in here is the name of your deployment. You can call it as you like. And then we will say, please use configuration file, which is called 2-tier template.yaml, and automatically roll back on error. As we can see, now our deployment is started. But if we would like to have a little bit more details on what's going on at the moment, we could go back to console, and in the console scroll down to deployment manager and look for deployments. So here we can see deployment 1, which is in progress, and when we open it, we will get all the details about the things that we are creating, the scripts that we are executing, and also we will see the progress. So I will pause for a moment, and once all of this is successfully deployed, we will proceed. As we can see here, our deployment is successfully finished. So now we can go back and have a look of what was deployed during this process. If we go to Google Console and main menu, first we will select networks. So here we can see what we just created. As you can see here, there is a default VPC network. That's not the one that we deployed. That's the one which was there by default. And if you don't need it, you can also delete it if you want. But what is important for us is we have a couple of networks that we just provisioned. The first one is DB VPC, Web VPC, and we have management and untrust. So that's perfectly well, and that's exactly what we need. And now we will look into instances. So when we select Compute Engine and VM instances, we should have these three in place and up and running. So as we mentioned at the beginning of this session, we have web server, we have also database server. They are in a different VPCs, and then we have VM-Series, which stands in front of them and is doing protection. So to start, we will take external IP, which is our management IP of Firewall, and try to log into it. Login credentials are provided in deployment guide, and if you search in here, you will find them on the page 24. So username is Palo Alto, and this is our password. One of the first things that we will review once we log in is if bootstrapping completed successfully. And the easiest way to know this is to go and have a look of configuration of your firewall. So if we look into the policies, we can see that they are loaded. If we look into the network tab, we can see that we have 3 interfaces all up and running, Untrust Web DB. So that's perfectly well, and that means that bootstrapping was successful. Before going any further, my suggestion is to go and to download latest threat database. So if we go to the device and select dynamic updates, we will see if we have anything. In this case it's empty, so we will check for the latest ones and install it. The reason why we need to do this is because as one of the attacks, we will do brute force password guessing to MySQL database server, and it's important that we have a content update for application and threads or our demo will fail. For the sake of time, I will make a small pause in here, and once I download everything and install everything, we will move from there. So now that installation is successful, we will start running some tests. First test that we will do will be to generate inbound traffic, and to do so we will go back to Google Console, select our VM-Series, our firewall, and there we will look for public IP of our Untrust interface. So this is our Untrust network, this is our public IP. We will copy it and run it in our browser, and if everything is okay, we will get a landing page of our web server. Now if we go back to the firewall and look into the monitoring, we should start seeing this traffic, and there it is. It is coming from this public IP, that's my public IP. It's coming from Untrust zone, going to the web zone, and it is web browsing. So that worked perfectly fine. Now the second test will be to open WordPress on this web server. So I will just type WordPress. And now that WordPress is opened, we will test both inbound as well as east-west traffic segmentation, because as you remember, we have web server and DB server with MySQL, and MySQL database that is used by WordPress is hosted on DB instance. So now if we go back to the firewall, we should see also traffic between zones, web and DB. And there we are. So we have Untrust to web and then web to DB. That works perfectly well as well. And the last test will be to run a couple of attacks. So we will go back to our web server, and now we will not use any more WordPress. We will just type SQL attack, and that's HTML. So now we have this page from where we can do a little bit of SSH attempts or brute force root password guessings. So let's start it by selecting first SSH attempt, and there we are. That seems to be working. And now we will also do SQL root password guessing. So that's launched as well. If we go back now to our firewall, we should see some denies and also threats. Here we can see that we have drop from web server to database server with a port number 22, and it is deny, because with the policies we don't allow SSH from web to MySQL, we only allow MySQL traffic. And if we go now to threat, there we should find that MySQL login authentication failed from zone web to zone database, and we successfully blocked that vulnerability as well. So with this, we are concluding our guided demonstration, and there's just one more thing which is left, and that is how to do the cleanup of your environment in a fully automated way by requesting from Deployment Manager to delete this deployment. To do so, we will go back to Google Cloud command line interface and run command which is gcloud deployment manager deployments delete, and then we will need to provide the name of our deployment, which in my case is deployment 1, and when we initiate it, it is going to delete all of the resources that we just previously deployed. With this, we have finished guided demonstration. As a next step, we would strongly suggest you to visit our cloud integration portal. There you can find lots of valuable resources as well as automation scripts and templates to help you out with your deployment on Google Cloud. And with this, I would like to thank you very much for joining me on this session and looking forward to your feedback.